Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Denis Maksimov. I'm curator of exhibitions and public programming here at Pushkin House. And it's my pleasure to welcome today Alexey Ulko, who was supposed to give a talk here in January, but due to some circumstances we needed to postpone it to April, although maybe it's for the best. The weather is better and nicer, although it doesn't look like that right now. And today, Alexey will speak about the images of colonial bodies in the Central Asian context, and also speak about the methodology that can allow us to rethink that subject and move ahead forwards in recontextualizing the art history of Central Asian art. And the talk will be structured in two main parts, and we'll have a small break between those parts for questions to each of the blocks that we'll be discussing. And without further ado, then I'll give the floor to Alexey. So think about your questions for the first line, and we'll more also think about this event as something a bit more informal and something a bit more workshop-based, let's say. So we'll be happy to hear your questions after each of the sections of the talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Denis. Is the sound okay? Good? Okay, cool. I'm just going to talk about things which I've been thinking about for many years, and the presentation is an ongoing process. I update it from time to time and adjust it to the situation. So it's very important to have a kind of conversation, because it's never fixed. It's never kind of carved in stone. So can we kind of... So I'll have to probably be somehow talking to Timofey from time to time. So just to remind you that of the situation around Central Asia. Of course, you don't have to tell you where Central Asia is, but I would like to remind you of the problem related to Central Asia. And I think that one of the problems is that sometimes it is seen as kind of homogeneous, rather undefined and unclear space, squeezed between Siberia and India, between the Far East and the kind of in Europe, right? So, which is kind of depicted on the right-hand side. And in this function, Central Asia has acquired a lot of sort of mythological kind of elements, and you know, one of these being Great Silk Road, and then the nomads, the Great Steppe, and so it's full of that essentialist concepts and feelings and attitudes. But also you can see that here I try to depict two important axes. One is horizontal, which is the Great Silk Road, more or less. Another one, which is very often a bit overlooked by outsiders, is the north-south divide, which is very pronounced in Central Asia itself, because there is a kind of a tension between the nomadic and sedentary population, although, of course, as in all those simplifications, the significance of that is exaggerated. So and I'll be talking mostly about the modern period of art, which could be traced probably back to the Russian conquest of Central Asia, sort of which starts in 1951, then continues for the whole part of the 19th century and ends in 1995. But then it can also be subdivided into different periods. The one which is the colonial proper, before the revolution of 1917. Then there is a period of Soviet power, Soviet period of different kinds, and there are also different stages within this period, and then there is a post-Soviet period, obviously, from 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the present. And each of these periods has got their own peculiarities, but then some of these qualities are inherited and kind of a move on. Can we? And of course, the topic will be sort of revolving around the concept of the colonial gaze, and you see here the quotation which I chose for this specific conversation: the colonial power produces the colonized as a fixed reality, which is at once the other and yet entirely knowable. That is important. So to give you, let's just, can we put them all together so that I don't really go into many details about those things. So I'm going to talk about 3 case studies from the colonial part. That is the Turkestan series of Vasily Vereshagin, probably the most famous and the most popular artist depicting the colonial past of Central Asia. But then also the Turkestan album, commissioned by von Kaufmann to celebrate the achievements of Russian colonial rule very early on in the process. And then, much later, photographic project by Prokudin-Gorsky, which is already was one of those first color photographic projects in Central Asia. So that is probably one of the most iconic, most well-known paintings by Vereshagin, which depicts my city, Samarkand. And I think that it sort of epitomizes the approach of Vereshagin, but also Vereshagin, of course, was not alone in his approach. So it's like focusing on detail, which gives an impression of realistic painting. But then the whole plot of those poles with apparently Russian soldiers' heads sort of perched on those poles is entirely fictional. So, and that combination of fictitious and realistic is something which has created a certain aura of Central Asia, which is sometimes very difficult to actually draw the line between imaginary and real, if there is such a thing as real. So, close-up of the way Vereshagin painted the colonized. So you can see here, again, this exaggeration of barbarity, but also exoticism and of very, very interesting attention to detail in costumes. So that was Vereshagin famous for. And as I already said, that by this he kind of deceived his viewers, because they were made think that everything which he depicted was documentary, but it was not. So here we've got also an interesting exaggeration of blackness of Uzbek soldiers. As somebody who knows Central Asians might probably see that they look more like Indians, or I don't know who, but that kind of exotization is there. And also he depicted different social classes of Central Asia, mostly by memory, because he visited Central Asia in 1868, but then left. And his Turkestan series was made in 1871 in München, exhibited in London for the first time in 1873, if I'm not mistaken. So a lot of what he had done was the product of studio work. So sketches, but then it's a studio work, but it does have this aura of documentary evidence. So you can see here on the left-hand side the opium eaters, on the right-hand side the rich owner of a yurta and probably cattle, because it's called the rich Kyrgyz, and Kyrgyz, of course, was a generic name for nomads at the time. So as you can see, the pictures which Vereshagin undertook were obviously imaginary, while Turkestan album is another way of imagining reality, because of course the models themselves are not imaginary, they're real people, but the way they are made to pose, of course, was rather artificial due to technical limitations. First of all, because at that time photographic equipment was not able to capture anything like a movement, so people had to pose for some time, to stand still, or to risk the pictures being sort of blurred. And all these people are indicated. They have each photograph has got a title, but usually it's a type of a Sart, a type of a Sart woman, a type of Kyrgyz. So they were presented as kind of elements of a certain typology. Although there were ways of learning who they were, and they were mostly from a kind of rather opulent classes of the society, so some kind of elite of the. So this gentleman over here, I think he was one of the kind of rulers of a small vilayat near Tashkent, I don't remember exactly. But also you can see that I really like that picture on the right, because the woman there is, you can see she's not really, she does not really correspond to that image of a sort of woman who is oppressed and who had to wear a kind of a veil. So she's open, rather relaxed, and which is an interesting indication of that image being rather exaggerated, the image of an oppressed and subjugated woman. So there was some kind of agency and this agency can be seen in some of the photographs of women at the time. So that was the study of religious practices. So several pictures of that gentleman reading namaz, and I think there were about 10 or 20 positions, like one after another. He was asked to pose, to stand, and then the picture was taken. So, and of course, the general gathering of Muslims in the mosque. But again, it's interesting that this is a very deep personalized photograph. Although, of course, you can imagine that the importance of those people, the importance of models who actually agreed to take part in this experiment was great, really. I mean, the photographers depended on these people, depended on their agreement, depended on them being, cooperative. So you would have expected some kind of recognition of their personalities or their character, but that was not the case. So in Prokudin-Gorsky's project, which took place much later, like 35, 40 years later, Prokudin-Gorsky, of course, was one of the pioneers of color photography. So, but also at that time, photography was already advanced enough so that he could capture some kind of movement. So, and that's why most of his photos look much more alive and natural than those of the Turkestan album. And it's also quite interesting to see that this gathering on the left-hand side is on the portal of the same madrasa, which was depicted by Vereshagin in his previous painting, in the painting which I had shown. It's, I think, Ulugbek Madrasa. Yeah. So, but 40 years later. And I quite like that picture on the right because it's kind of full of character. And you just wonder who this person who sits outside the prison is. Maybe a translator, maybe kind of a, I don't know, just a neighbor. But I find this a fascinating picture in its character tension and subjectivity, which kind of shines through this, despite, of course, the anonymity of the people there. Well, again, I think Prokudin-Gorsky was very much aware because he did the survey of the peoples of the Russian Empire. So he was very much aware of what people actually did. So in his photograph, you can see some kind of difference between the sedentary people and what they did, their occupation, their profession, their ways of living, and to a less extent, the nomads crossing the Sirdarya plains on the right-hand side. And you can see here he chooses a kind of semi-detached, sort of a medium plane. He doesn't come very close, but he doesn't see them as a mass. So you can still see people's faces. You could still see that they were in some kind of relations with the photographer, but probably more with the sedentary people, because he obviously had more time to work with them than with the nomads. And just, so just to remind you of what was going on at the time, so when we talk about art of Central Asia at the time, fine arts, we of course mean mostly and almost exclusively paintings and drawings made by the Russians, Europeans, photographs of the same of the colonizer, made by the colonizer of the colonized, and the art of the indigenous people of the time does not really figure in the art histories of the time. So it's studied as kind of as a separate branch. It's usually seen as applied art, for example. So applied art of the time, and ceramics and wood carving and metal works, they are not usually seen together. Or they, even now, you can see the albums of art from the time, and there's a very clear classification, a very clear distinction between the different types of art. This self-explanatory. I have already talked about this exoticism, barbarity, which are emphasized, but also this apartheid, which is very obvious there, and the desire to see the natives, as the term was at the time, as kind of untouched by civilization, which of course is now being deconstructed, and there's been a massive core of works actually showing that there's been a lot more dialogue between Uzbeks and the Russians and the Tatars and the Kyrgyz, and so the split between the sedentary people and nomads was not as obvious as it was seen by the kind of positive science, positive academia of the time. But still, this impersonal representation remains the key kind of element of all those works. So there's been never a portrait as such, until I think Prokutyn-Gorsky made a very specific portrait of the Emir of Bukhara, but then again it's Emir who is already personified. Right, so the Soviet national building program is something which is, again, is a very much a contested area of science, or of history, and there have been again many works interpreting it from different viewpoints. But I think that what is important here is that we have at least several competing and often competing in a different way. The concepts of nation, of what it was. So it could have been easily one nation, after all, or could have been 10 different nations, different formations. So the fact that we've got like 5 republics and 1 autonomous republic. And that is just one of those possible outcomes, but not, of course, anything like prearranged or predestined form of national delimitation. And I think that we have here also several things going at the same time in the society, where you've got gradual ossification of the Marxist theory, and with the adoption of socialist realism in 1932 as the main and kind of the key method of artistic depiction, of course, corresponds with the initial stages of creating kind of the art, the culture of those nations, which was supposed to be naturally flowing from the previous generations, but it was not so natural as the authorities of the time wanted to be. So there's a lot of social construction going on, and I think that it actually shows pretty well in the paintings, and I'm looking mostly in the paintings of the time. How are we doing for time? Fine. So. Pavel Kuznetsov, of course, his first paintings are predate obviously this is the Soviet regime, so he cannot be probably seen as the Soviet painter, but he's got that approach which was then later on developed and became quite a well, I should say probably mainstream or very common in the depiction of the plains and the space of Central Asian life. And so you can see here the common tropes, the yurts, the camels, the people cooking food, and then the sky, which is like an infinite sky and so on. So Volkov, of course, who, unlike Kuznetsov, who was born in Russia and traveled only to Central Asia, Volkov was born in Central Asia. So he studied in St. Petersburg and Kiev, but he came back to Tashkent. So his attention to detail is much more grounded in realities of the life he knew pretty well, and he was fascinated by this. And applying some of the techniques and methods which were born outside Central Asia, even born outside Russia, I think he kind of very freely experimented with different forms, because at that time there was no, should I say, no any kind of dictatorial form of prescription of how Central Asia should be depicted. That came later, of course. Может дальше? And then we have Usto Mumin with his very slender and almost feminine kind of depictions of men and boys, and I mean, now we've got two books which came out fairly recently about Usto Mumin. One is by Leonora Shafransk, another is by Boris Chukovich, so I would strongly recommend you to have a look at those, because they contain kind of most probably comprehensive information about Usto Mumin as of today, and the analysis of his style, which owes much to Persian miniature, to the Italian Quattrocento, and maybe other forms of art, which kind of synthesized by Usto Mumin. And you can see that one of the most important paintings of probably of whole Central Asia, of Uzbekistan definitely, that is Volkov and the pomegranate tea house, which inspired, both these works inspired huge number of epigones, huge number of copyists, and eventually I will show you that that kind of style became kind of one of those definitions of mainstream of today. Yeah, so and then of course comes the time of the consolidation of nations. That was epitomized by the Constitution of 1936 and the Census of 1939, where the whole array of tribes and clans and groups, national communities which existed before, yielded its place to several titular nations. And at the same time, the consolidation of course, political oppression and socialist realism. So we can see here kind of more frivolous and less frivolous, more formal paintings of the time, when already people, again, they're still kind of rather impersonal, but they, what is important, they become more and more kind of typical. So they don't just represent a type, but they themselves kind of embody or maybe manifest some kind of typicality, like the girls who go to the theater, and then Kosteyev, his character Amangildi, who of course was a heroic figure from the Kazakh Soviet, from the beginning of the Kazakh Soviet state. After that period, after the Stalin's period of this imperial, you can say, so imperial realism, comes the period of orientalism, but a very different one to the one of the earlier time. So you have here the influence of an avant-garde, but in a much more conscious way. So artists now employed techniques and methods in the way they think is appropriate, and you can see obviously here the references to Gauguin and Matisse, and here the Latin American monumentalists, Siqueiros and others. Which is interesting. What I find particularly fascinating here is that they depict Uzbek women, both of them depict Uzbek women, with a very different tone. So here we have that light-hearted exoticism, And this is quite a late painting, which shows, of course, Uzbek women picking cotton, which at that time was seen as a form of liberation. But you can see there again, they're kind of over-exoticized, over-sexualized, and in fact, that doesn't look to me like a painting made in 1978 at all. So it sort of hacks back to the earlier times. But anyway, so of course now picking up cotton manually is a huge taboo, is a contested area, and Uzbekistan has been punished severely for this manual labor, child labor, forced labor of cotton pickers. And only recently this boycott of Uzbek cotton ceased to be applied. So, but at that time it was still seen as the white gold, the kind of something which you can be proud of. These are the interesting forms of what I would call Soviet internationalism, when artists were very much aware of the existence of different ethnic groups within the society and outside the society as well. So you can see here two very important artists, Nigmat Kuzubayev and Samik Abdullayev, who depict here we have Russian doctors, Russian veterinaries visiting shepherds in the mountains, and there is an interesting tension between the young vet from Russian vet and the kind of old and obviously quite experienced shepherd who's Uzbek. I quite like the picture because it sort of doesn't show you any conflict, but it shows you some kind of tension. Here the tension is different, and the message, of course, is very different again. So you have the theater named after Alisher Navai, but it is the big opera theater in Tashkent, and you see the girls, Uzbek girls, preparing for a performance for a concert. And obviously they are extremely westernized, so they play Western musical instruments, they are dressed like any kind of imaginary European girls would be at the time. And the tension is between the older and younger musicians here. So there is a kind of a generation gap, so several generations of people playing this kind of music. And and that sort of style, which I've just described as internationalism, almost kind of died a death with the end of the Soviet Union. And by the end of the Soviet Union, of course, that sort of style became more and more popular, some kind of patriarchal and with lots of nostalgia for some kind of imaginary traditional forms, and not necessarily imaginary traditional forms of art, but traditional forms of life depicted in these two. You can see here a realistic painting of 1974, and a bit later, sort of, I don't know what, primitivist painting, but depicting some kind of the mythology of Uzbek people as seen by artists. And it's interesting that that kind of art, also when it has been rendered in the form of cinematography and photography, has influenced a lot about people's perception of themselves. And when you ask people, and I'm sure those of you who know Central Asia would agree that we ask people about what is happening in Central Asia, what kind of lives do they have. And people very often don't describe to you what is going on. They describe to you what should be happening. Some kind of a ritual which they know should be performed, but when you see it, it's done in a different way. And that kind of art of imaginary reflection of your own life has become more and more and more important in the post-Soviet time. Timofey? So here we have some interesting forms. That's a painting by Akmal Nur, who has been the chairman of the Academy of Art of Uzbekistan. And his art can be seen as some kind of the mainstream, the epitome of mainstream painting in Uzbekistan, which is also explores some of the tropes discovered by Volkov, by Usto, Mumin, by his predecessors, but he keeps kind of a balance between that romantic description and sort of romantic description of a folk life, but totally imaginary. In here, I made several pictures of unknown Kazakh painters when I visited Almaty, and I was walking around the Academy of Art named after Zhurgenov. What was interesting that the event I attended was about contemporary art, but the paintings which you could see on the walls were like this. All realistic or stylized in the style of Persian miniatures, but predominantly about kind of imaginary figures of the past, like all those riders and hunters and warriors, and that contrast was very interesting to me. So to attend a conference on contemporary art, contemporary culture management, very neoliberal, but then very traditionalist kind of painting on the walls. So there's also an interesting, again, interesting exploration of the tensions, cultural tensions. So you can see here Bahadur Jalal kind of referencing some kind of Botticelli-like figure. So he demonstrates his knowledge and maybe kind of cultural heritage. He has in his own style, because I think it's a very obvious reference. In Muhammad Fazili on the right has got an interesting, I would call it coded message, the way out of the black square, and there are several ways out of it. I don't really understand what is happening in the left top corner, but here we have Malevich, you have got the pomegranate again as a symbol of, I don't know, of Central Asianness, I think. So, and then there is a cosmic element, which kind of a planet, which perhaps is the way out as a way of science. But what is interesting here is, so he does not challenge the colonial sort of paradigms in any particular way, but talking about a way out of black square, he kind of hints at this opportunity that there is a way of rethinking the black square as the kind of the dogmatic, the doxic kind of form of art.
It's Kaaba.
Yeah, could be Kaaba. Yeah, and so the first, that is kind of very brief, and I hope rather kind of diverse account of different forms of painting over the period of 100 years. So on the right-hand side, you can see here the very recent work by contemporary artists already, who I didn't really want to talk about, didn't really want to touch on contemporary artists that much. But that is Yerbolsin Mildibekov from Kazakhstan, and his depiction of Nazarbayev, rather interestingly called 30 Years and 3 Seconds. So, and these are the questions which I think we might want to consider before we go to the next stage, whether it's going to be a, second part of my presentation, or whether it's going to be a discussion and a couple of questions.
There are some questions at this, for this particular part of the presentation. Sarah?
I'm sorry, yes, this is just factual. I'm sorry, I didn't understand who made the second album of photographs.
Yes, the second album of photographs was, you mean Prakudin-Gorsky?
After the painter, you know, VV as I call him, then you had plain,
the second, right, the Turkestan album, right?
Yeah.
Turkestan album was commissioned by the General Kaufman, and he employed several photographers. Again, so they're not credited, they're credited somewhere, but they are not seen as, it's not an auteur work. With Prakudin-Gorsky, he was the creator, the director, the technician, and he was very much the character who did it. With the Turkestan album, it was much more impersonal on both sides, on the side of the model, but also on the side of photographers, who were seen as kind of purely technical.
Sorry, I've got one question, which is that when was studying Röhrig, for example, all these developments relate to university developments and the formation of ethnography as a university discipline. So it's not just like oh, they're peasants, this is an ethnographic gaze. There's a lot of discourse behind it, and ethnographers and people going out, you know, doing, as it were, ethnography as well as painting things. And I wanted to ask you, was that a kind of, did everything in terms of university disciplines also emanate from Moscow in a way that could be perceived in a certain way, or was it also coming from centers in, for example, Uzbekistan?
I think that it depends on the time, and the first universities, of course, in Central Asia appeared only in the 1920s. So before that, all knowledge was was emanating from Moscow and St. Petersburg in different forms. Which is interesting is that you've got, like in the shape of Volkov, who was not a university professor, of course, but he was an artist born in Central Asia. So there is an interesting tension, you could say, between people who were from this area, who were born in Central Asia. Some of them might have been able to speak the languages, and then some people from the outside. And of course, those people from the outside, they also possess a very interesting and paradoxical knowledge of the area, like Bartold and all those orientalists of the past. So they spoke languages, they could read, stuff like that. But they never properly lived in Central Asia, so for them, and that continued until, I think, in the 60s and 70s. We've got that kind of dichotomy between your real experience as a person and your academic knowledge. And very often one shaped another. So, for example, the anthropological approach to museum collections very much shaped the way people later perceived their own art. And like, for example, creating artificial typologies of what it means to have Jizak porcelain, Samarkand porcelain, and so on. So they were classified first by academia, by orientalists, and then it became the reality.
Any more reactions, questions, comments?
Thank you very much. That was fascinating. My question is, who were the patrons of the painters? Were they Uzbek patrons, or did everything go off to St. Petersburg and Moscow?
Well, it depends on the time, obviously, because, for example, Vereshagin, his series of paintings was commissioned by the Governor General, but also he was a commercial painter. So he was making paintings which were bought, and he lived off that. And that's why, in fact, he could be sometimes seen as too much of a propagandist, but he was also a commercial painter who wanted to shock, to amuse, and to attract a buyer. That was not, of course, the case with the later painters, because they formed already different kind of communities, artistic communities, and very often they painted, but paintings, but they earned a living doing something different. For example, porcelain, or tiles, or wallpaper designs. So that was a kind of situation in the 20s, very much. But then in the 30s, the system was again very different between the state commissioned different kind of paintings and drawings for different purposes. So it could be a design, could be a painting on a certain topic, and so there was could have been a tender from artists who would submit their sketches, and then the commission would choose who will be given money to proceed with the execution of that particular painting. So there were different forms of remuneration at the different times.
Thank you. Do you think that such kind of art could have been used to disseminate Soviet ideologies? And can the museum be decolonized? Because you have mentioned that the women in the pictures that were depicted shows some kind of agency, but the literature, let's say in Western academia, we see the vice versa, right? So women were oppressed, especially after the hujum and all the movements, but when you look at the paintings, we can see the agency. So for example, when I visited Savitsky Museum, I tried just to understand and to find out some kind of agency depicted through those paintings. So can we decolonize the museum? And could this kind of art also use it to disseminate some kind of Soviet ideologies? Thank you.
Yes, but I think that it is much more complex than is sometimes believed today in Central Asia. I think when we say, and you can hear that in Kazakhstan a lot, we are decolonizing something as if you are a subject which is free of any colonial perspective. So you are there as the source of decolonization, and you decolonize an object or a space. I think that if we're talking about this seriously, and I'm going to talk about that in the second part, that we should really start with working on ourselves, on the work with our own coloniality, our own colonial perception, because sometimes we see something as authentic or maybe real or decolonial, while you just look at that from a different perspective, and it actually is colonial. It's like really is the product of colonial gaze, but kind of re-accentuated in a different way. So my answer would be yes. Of course, the museums and collections, they somehow consciously and subconsciously were the vehicles for the Soviet ideology. But then Soviet ideology in itself is not like it's not monolithic. It's not something which deserves to be labeled only as, for example, oppressive. So there are a lot of other things which could be sometimes seen as liberating, of course, obviously as well, but also something which can be only opened up and deconstructed only with a hindsight. So while those collections were made in a certain way, according to certain principles, the result was often, and I would say always, quite different to the intentions that were expressed by the collectors themselves. So it's a complex question, and I think it hinges on reflection very much.
I think the question actually creates a great bridge to the second part, so save your questions further. And maybe we can go to the second part, and after this great contextualization of the Central Asian art history, speak about what shall be done from your point of view.
Okay. So yes, the second part of the presentation, as I have already said, it's not a part of. I mean, it's contextualized here as two parts of the same talk. The talk is which we are taking part in, is kind of unique, but the presentations are slightly different, and but one is derived from another. So with these questions which I posed at the end of my previous presentation, I wanted to think about different forms of dealing with this colonial gaze, different forms of dealing with our own coloniality. And of course, it was triggered, that conversation which I'm going to hold now, and the ideas which I kind of generated were triggered by the war, or this part of the war of Russia against Ukraine. Let me continue. Can we just put them all together? So you can see here is a kind of a plan for the talk, and I want to mention the war as a trigger and touch upon, but not really elaborate upon, the liabilities of all sorts for the war, and who is to be blamed, who is responsible, and why this particular group or that particular person could be seen as involved. And then I will go into looking at the way of decolonizing the situation. I can't really even say decolonizing what, because it's not very easy to pinpoint the object. So I think that you can more or less confidently identify 5 ways of doing it, or 5 areas of decolonization, or 5 practices. One is the boycott, the cancel Russia. Another one is the questioning of the Soviet nationality program and rebuilding the national or the ethnic element, reclaiming maybe sometimes. Then there is an issue of language, whether the language can be decolonized, and if yes, then how and which language. Then we will talk a bit about, I think, the Soviet legacy as a political compromise. And then there are 2 more things, which is about the some kind of deconstruction of the Russian narratives or the Soviet narratives as well, but also leading towards reflecting. And I think that the outcome of all this is that it's much more complex, it's much more difficult to actually reflect on your own coloniality, reflect on your own practices, and to see what you want to do with them, because it's very easy to kind of articulate some kind of well-learned slogans from decolonial literature, which is abundant and well read by many people, but it's not very easy to apply that. So yes, so I think these 2 pictures kind of show an interesting case of multiple identities. I think that very often when people talk about decolonization, about reaction towards Russian invasion and so on, the underlying assumption is that there is one way of dealing with this, that we have to find this way, and there is one way of looking at it, which is correct, and others are not. So, and I've come across this sort of implication so often. But what I think is important is to see that what we're dealing with, the multiple identities which we all are subject to. And so here we have, I think, a demonstration in Moscow against the war of a Russian girl who, you can see here, holds a poster saying, Russia is us, not Putin, which is an interesting claim. Because you think this juxtaposition, us, not him, is a desire to claim Russia for themselves. And so we don't agree with the war. We are there, but who are we? That's an interesting question. So what are we as well? This photo is taken in Tashkent. It's on the 9th of May. One of those events where you have people gathering in the memorial to the Second World War, and you might probably know that in Uzbekistan the war, the Great Patriotic War of Russia, is officially known as the Second World War. Although, interestingly enough, when it is commemorated, it is not commemorated as 1939-45. It is still 1941-45, but the name for it is the Second World War. So, but then obviously the George Ribbon is an open commitment to an alternative view, to the Russia-centric view. So you have here a girl who's probably Uzbek, wearing hijab, but also being committed to this Russia-centric vision of the war. And I think that these two very different pictures, 2 different women, I think they exemplify really well the complexity of the situation. And I'm going to talk about this a bit more. So when we talk about, for example, boycott Russia, what kind of culture, what exactly do we boycott, or we don't, or we reject, or we accept, and then it's very difficult actually to draw the line, if there is a line between all those things. And who are us, who are them? It's all complex. Well, just to remind you of that cancel Russia sort of thing, which is, I think, a rather beautiful picture. So, I think that the cancel Russia is a kind of a policy which is, let's go back to, so it's sort of very natural the natural reaction to this phase of the war. Of course, we should remember that the war started not in 2022, but in 2014. And the most probable date for the beginning of the war is 20th of February 2014, engraved on the medals for the occupation of Crimea. But then, as soon as you start kind of pursuing this policy of cancelling Russia, which is natural, it's like something has to be done. Russia has to be punished for what they're doing. But then the question is, who is punishing whom? And who is complicit? What makes you an oppressor? Is it a passport of a Russian citizen? Or is it your name? Or is it your political view? Or language you speak, as the first language? So it's all very complex. And I think that there has been a lot of talk. I hope that it's now kind of going down a bit. I mean, people are becoming quieter on this cancel Russia policy. But I think that at the same time it's very superficial. But then in its you can even say maybe hollow kind of message, but it's a very natural reaction. It's a reactionary thing. And the question is that what can be done further? I mean, how do you do that? How do you proceed with this impetus? And that is where all those complexities, I think, kind of surface, and they can be seen as really, really difficult. Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, I don't know if cancel Russia is global or not global, and if when now you're talking from your position or like all of us.
I think that that's what I'm saying, that it is very, very fragmented. So to some people it seems like global, and on a certain level it is. Because, for example, if you think about the, and people don't really talk a lot about UN and the Geneva Conventions and stuff like that, and because it is seen as too maybe complex to many. But then you've got the international community working on this, so it's not just like some countries or some liberals who want to cancel Russia. I think there is a question of reacting in a spontaneous way, and many people do that in different ways. And I wouldn't call it global, because the word global itself carries an interesting connotation. But I would say that it is widely spread across borders. So it's not confined to one culture, to one political view, to one ethnic group, or So it is a widely spread phenomenon, in my view. An interesting issue, which deserves, of course, a special discussion, is whether the language is an issue. Sometimes it becomes the only issue which sort of separates people, whether you adhere to a certain language. Like that may be the case in Ukraine very often in Samarkand, for example. So there is a Tajik speakers, Uzbek speakers, or bilingual people who speak two languages, but one is something that they think is their mother tongue, and that makes them Tajiks. So, but sometimes the language is just a tool of communication. The question is, of course, who owns the language? Is it somebody, something? Is it people, or is it the government? It's whether the language itself has got some kind of essence or character which makes it more appropriate for certain kinds of meaning, or is it an abstract identity, which is abstract entity, which is devoid of any political meaning? So that is something which we need to think about, and whether the influence of one language on another is natural because it's accepted by the people, or is it something artificial which is dictated by the fact that the carriers or the speakers of that language occupy a certain position within the society. So, and what it means to be, for example, a Russian speaker. Does it mean to be an ethnic Russian, or is anyone who speaks Russian to some extent a Russian speaker. And that, of course, is the view which I share, that the language is owned by those who use it. Even those who may not have it as their first language, maybe not the language of their choice, but still, if you, we're here, lots of us are from Central Asia or Russia, to whom English is not their first language, but it's the language of choice here in this particular context. And whether it has got any implication for the information we're sharing is an interesting question to consider. But my main topic here, my main sort of message of these questions would be, again, if we talk about decolonizing the Russian language, and that is, of course, a very good idea, kind of divorce it from its current political content. But how is it possible? Is it possible in reality, or is it something which we can only think of and maybe somehow arrange in a narrow circle of people who, for example, refuse to watch Russian TV, refuse to speak Russian? I don't know. But then the relationship between ethnicity and national identity is something which doesn't pertain only to Russian, of course. And it's very much a problem of all Central Asian and all post-Soviet nations, ethnic groups. And it's not something which can be easily resolved. And unless it is resolved, the whole issue of colonial content will remain sort of hovering above the whole situation. Can we continue? So this, so it's a kind of a random, very random list of different names related to different aspects of reclaiming national culture. So, and you can see that happening in many situations when, for example, you remember was a famous case early in 2022 of renaming painting by Degas, which had been known as Russian dances, but then it was discovered that the dances depicted were Ukrainian dances, so they renamed it. And then you work on issues like whether Malevich was more like Polish or Ukrainian, or was he a Russian? So this kind of re-ascribing the ethnic background is something which is happening. I'm not saying that it is an important or a progressive or kind of a remedy. But it's something which is taking place and is going to take place anyhow, as long as we are using the ethnicity as the synonym for nationality. And so if we want to deal with that, we have to tackle this connection between ethnicity and nationality. And then, of course, depending on how we resolve this dichotomy, we might consider whether Malevich is Ukrainian or Polish, or it doesn't really matter at all, or he is both. And you can see also here there are examples of other kind, when you have people of different ethnic origin kind of creating national art for a particular Soviet nation, like Tamara Khanum, for example, is a great example of Armenian person, Armenian dancer who became the godmother of Uzbek dance in many ways. And so you have also people with fluid identity, like Sadreddin who became one of the founding fathers of Uzbek literature in the Soviet time, and then he decided that he wanted to be more of a Tajik writer, and he moved to Dushanbe and became the father of the Tajik literature. So is it possible? What is real? What is fake? So it's a big issue, and I think that, again, the topic of nation is very contested. A lot has been written about that, but again and again in this decolonial discourse of today, we have to come back to this. So the definition of this, whether we are reifying the concept of nation. And in many cases it is so. And what I hear often is a situation when people, on the one hand, they talk about sort of social deconstruction, very knowledgeably, lots of quotations about from Fanon and Baba and other writers, and then you step aside and then they say, oh, but the Kazakhs were here first. So everything is socially constructed, but now we were here first. Things like that happens all the time. So that's why I've got here this national culture with the interrogation mark, whether this is a productive discourse. And I think that the question is, how useful is it and how fluid it is? Because if you think about the relationship between nations and the Soviet identity in the Soviet days was also quite fluid, quite unclear. My impression is that, and I've written about that already, that the Soviet was normalized on the basis of Russian culture, while others were seen as kind of representatives of their national culture in separate niches. So, for example, the urban, the educated, the higher education, and things like industries and contemporary progressive were Soviet, were attributed to the Soviet culture, and by definition that implied Russian culture. While if you wanted to be a Georgian writer, you had to write in Georgian, you were associated with symbols of Georgia. Uzbeks, of course, could also be seen as, you know, through stereotypes of this ethnic equality and ethnic character, and that association with some kind of exotic imagery which was developed in the course of time in association with a particular ethnic group. I think it's kind of this double-edged sword is a difficult thing, because to many people that has become the reality, and people self-exoticize themselves very often, and when they write or talk about themselves, they want to see themselves in terms of those colonial images. And the question is, do we have the right to say, well, no, that's not right. What you're doing is completely fake. You are kind of pursuing the colonial kind of paradigm, and you have to give it up. I mean, can anyone do that? I doubt that it is possible. But you can see here that the national discourse, of course, is going to be worked on and is not going anywhere anytime soon. So a big conversation is, of course, whether the Soviet is colonial or not, whether the language of post-colonial and decolonial theories can be applied to the Soviet Union. And you've got different issues, different topics. To me, the first conversation which I have noticed, which was very much about this, took place in 2001 between Ekaterina Dyogat, as an important Russian curator of today, and Margarita Dikovitskaya, who's rather less known. And the conversation was whether the Russians of today can have the same benefits as the indigenous people, as blacks, as other colonized nations and groups in the world, because the Russians have also lost the colonial war to the West, so the West should also apply affirmative action to the Russians, because the Russians are now being defeated, and the Soviet project was defeated, and that was something which was kind of promoted by Dyogat. But then Margarita Dikovitskaya opposed her and said, well, Russia, of course, has got something to do with the colonial discourse, but only because it is itself a colonial power. So it has to solve this issue. So that was, I think, one of the first discussions of this, which I know when you have two different positions sort of very clearly articulated and opposed to each other. But then the question whether the post-colonial theories can be applied to the Soviet situation. My question would be also whether it still applies to the current situation. And whenever I write about the colonial situation, I often use those square brackets to show that the word post is again quite ambiguous. Sometimes you don't really know whether we're living in a post-colonial state, or is it still colonial, but has become shaped and articulated in a different way. So sometimes I have these doubts, and sometimes I think it's appropriate to question that. You remember that picture by Vereshagin? It's very interesting also to look at I think it's a very great example of how Vereshagin was portrayed and how he was discussed during his two exhibitions in Moscow and St. Petersburg, which took place, I think, in 2017 and 18. And you can see here the two rather interesting texts, which I randomly picked up from the catalog on Vereshagin, which was published, and in particular the last one, which says that Vereshagin shows the violence, cruelty, and immorality of the real East, actually goes back to this quality which I already mentioned, where Vereshagin had a very acute attention to detail. He was very exact in the way he depicted, light and shadow and different kind of ornaments. But then whether that exactness had anything to do with the topics which he chose, and that is a big question. But obviously you can see here the art critics from Russia who wanted to believe that. And it's very interesting way of actually analyzing the situation from the viewpoint of which Sergei Bashin called colonialism without colonialism. So Vereshagin was there, he was discussed, he was openly analyzed and deeply analyzed as a painter, but then the colonial element was kind of non-existent in the discourse, which was, or one of those very interesting passages from the catalogue was also about that there could have been no colonial tension between Russia and Central Asia because the Russians also are Asians and things like that. So lots of very interesting statements which I encourage you to read when you have time and you've got access to this wonderful catalogue. So, and this brings us, of course, to the question of this difference between the historic colonialism and coloniality. And I think that in Central Asia we tend to kind of rethink the history of colonial occupation in two literal terms. So, especially obvious it was in the books, history books, and published in the 19th in Uzbekistan, when you had the story of colonization kind of inverted. I mean, it was not changed, it was not analyzed, it was not critiqued, it was just inverted. So the Reds became the bad ones, the Basmachis became the freedom fighters. So it was a rather clumsy, I think, operation, but it still takes place in many Central Asian contexts when people don't really question the description itself. They question the marks, they question the assessment, and they give different assessment to different situations, while the story remains very much the same, told in the terms of national identities, told in terms of the succession of socio-economic formations, and that is a big question. So, and I think that's the most difficult part of everything. So, to think of your own coloniality as opposed to the history of colonialism. And whenever I hear some angry voices about the need to decolonize something and to punish the colonizers in one way or another, I think, well, are we not replicating the same mechanisms here of oppression, but through different appropriation of symbols, through different appropriation of ethnic groups, and so on. So that is an interesting thing, which, and then I'm using this term as reverse copies of the Soviet policies. But then, of course, again, is decolonization possible without redrawing the borders, without redistribution of wealth, or is it kind of a mental exercise which we're happy to undertake as much as we want because they won't have any kind of consequences? So to me it's a big question. To me it's a big question whether we can actually talk about decolonizing Russia, for example. Well, Are we decolonizing Russia now, or are we just talking about it? I don't know. Some of those interesting depictions of things, again, going back to borders. So we have paintings, again, that is from all three are Kazakh paintings. So this, on the left is one of those which I took a picture of in the halls of the Art Academy in Kazakhstan. This one, as you can see here, is a Turkic warrior subjugating the Russian serf or the Russian messenger who came with the capitulation. That belongs to a very interesting character, Kairat Zakiryanov. I mean, you really need to check him out, because he's the one of those rather erratic, rather interesting amateur historians who's rewriting the history of Central Asia in the sense of giving all the credit to the nomads, all the civilization credits to the nomads. Just read him. I'm not going to go into detail. But on the right-hand side, you've got a painting by a contemporary painter who's very knowledgeable, who's got this project, When We Were the Kazakh, when people were Kazakh. So he undertook this task of repainting a series of iconic portraitures as if they were not like white, but more like Turkey, more like Kazakh-like. But then again, the question is whether he's kind of challenging the colonial perceptions, or is he reinforcing them? And again, I think that it's not very easy to actually give the definitive answer, because to me, as much as he wants to reclaim the Kazakhnes or as a part of like world culture, but at the same time he sort of follows that representation, which is entirely colonial. So difficult. Just a couple of words about the Soviet. I think that some of you may not be very happy to hear what I am going to say, but I think that there's a new fashion of Soviet modernism which has been spread. I mean, there were kind of studies of the Soviet modernism in the past, but currently it's become kind of an interesting mainstream fashion, and everybody is now a Soviet modernist. And I think that one of the reasons for that is that it's kind of makes two sides very happy, the left wing and the right wing. So the left wing see it as a commemoration and celebration of the emancipatory character of the Soviet of the Soviet ideology and practices and internationalism and so on. But the right wing, of course, see it as a kind of achievement of their national whatever. If it's Moscow modernism, then the primacy of Moscow over other countries of the Soviet Union. If it's Tashkent modernism, then the primacy of Tashkent as an urban center of civilization and so on. So I'm very curious about this, whether that's going to, which way this is going to develop. This whole story of Soviet, and I think that the word revisionism is inappropriate here. So there's a revision is going on, and whether it's okay to talk about the Soviet project kind of outside of the context of its colonial character and oppressive character. So is it okay? And it's interesting when you look, for example, at the way Nazi regime is discussed. You can't really divorce. You can't just talk about those wonderful rockets which Werner von Braun developed, or those autobahns which were built in the 30s, without referring to the background. But you can, for some strange reason, talk about the Soviet regime in the same way. And I think it's a very interesting situation whether this is universally accepted or not. And I think that there is a need to, at least to go back to the critique of the Soviet legacy, so which is not reduced to the Sovietology of the 80s and the 70s, but it sort of sees it as something quite different in the view of the current situation. So, and that's a big issue that we need to tackle as well. So, and for one of those, of course, issues is that whether we can still talk about the post-Soviet, whether when we say it's a post-Soviet space, do we not pin it to a certain culture, to a certain political configuration? And when define Uzbekistan as one of the post-Soviet countries, or Georgia, do we not kind of already indicate that it doesn't have the enough agency to be on its own? But the question is what to replace it with. Difficult. Yeah. So I think that this is just a couple of examples of those very popular films, which could be seen as kind of both are dedicated to Central Asia. You might know them, but then they can also be seen as rather strongly colored in colonial undertones, and it would be interesting to see and to read one of those colonial deconstruction of these films, because they are also very popular. So they're not just there on the periphery, but they form as a kind of basically belong to the classical core of cinematography that determined the way cinema developed in the region. Okay. Yeah, so I would like to just look at some of the ways the Soviet heritage, Soviet legacy kind of reveals itself in contemporary projects, not directly, not through the reference to Lenin, Marx and so on, but through the living through the imagery which has been very much developed in the Soviet time. So here is a rather bizarre complex on the Istiklal Lake called Ala Mordo, which you can see here represents a very interesting ways of depicting the traditionalism and the modernism of Kyrgyz people at the same time. So the struggle of the Kyrgyz against the oppressive regimes, young Kyrgyz fighting the dragon. Whoever the dragon symbolizes is difficult to say, whether it's China, whether it's Russia, whether it's corruption. It's probably all over. But then I think that it's a very direct consequence of the kind of artistic education in the 70s and the 80s, but which bore fruit in the 90s. And you can say that it's nationalistic, but it's decolonial. You can say it's die-hard Soviet. Again, I can see it's like a hand in a glove. So you have a certain content which kind of is there, but on the surface it's wrapped into a different cultural narrative. Можно дальше? And that is something which is happening in Uzbekistan now. It's a very different type of it's much more recent. It's done by Babur Ismailov, designed by Babur Ismailov, our artist, who's an important artist for contemporary Uzbekistan, a gifted person, who's well known for his paintings, but he also designed this eternal city in Samarkand, which you can see as an imitation of the Timurid city for tourists, but also as they claimed that it is a kind of contemporary reinterpretation of the traditional space, artistic space. And you can believe him or you may not. So you can think that it's just total fake, it's a Disneyland for tourists, or maybe not. Maybe he's absolutely right that it sort of forms a new version of the traditional space, executed now with contemporary technical materials. And therefore it's a kind of die-hard postmodernist sort of undertaking. But anyway, it's still very much the reliving of the dreams of the architects from the 70s and the 80s. An important thing here, which I think is, it's already closing now, the conversation, is decentralizing of Russia, which is a difficult task because it's a question of who's going to do that. What I mean here is that when you think of, for example, contemporary art in the post-Soviet space, you kind of more or less, by definition, think that, okay, it's all started with the bulldozer exhibition, or then with Moscow conceptualists, who are the gods on the Olympus, and then everything else was derived from them, and you go that Russia-centric or Moscow-centric vision, which is kind of universally accepted, and when people talk about the need to decolonize Russia, they still think in terms of this, in terms of that hierarchy, which is not always the case. And when we discuss the need to give more agency to, let's say, local artists, and that is done again in a way as if they are kind of discovered now, and they should be given some kind of recognition by the people who are there, or by the people who stay close to the to those art institutions in Moscow. But then it's not necessarily the only way to do this. And I'm now undertaking an interesting project in Baku very soon, which would be trying to discuss how we can bypass that centrality. Can we go on? So that is an interesting example of, I'm not going to talk about that for a long time. If you want to hear that, I can talk about that. That's some of the examples of current communication in Tashkent between the artists and curators who relocated from Russia, from Moscow to Tashkent. And then you have international curators, and how it is all working together, how it's all, well, is there any coherence between local artists, say international artists, Russian artists, curators, whether there are three different groups of people, do they represent different communities or not? And can we go on? And I think that's the framework which I kind of really can propose. So I think that first of all, we need to really start with reflecting. So very often those very good, well-intentioned ideas of decolonizing something, deconstructing something, those call for action, they are not preceded by a sufficient amount of reflection and self-analysis. So I would say that research and reflection of these issues should start the conversation and then lead towards actions. So it's not enough just to borrow some slogans and frameworks from Fanon or Mignolo or somebody and apply them immediately to our context. So we need to unlearn the language of coloniality, and that is, of course, not a question of a Russian language. It's a question of the notions, the ideas, the concepts which we're still operating, and we're not questioning this enough. I think that very often, again, those quick calls for actions, they lead towards what I call essentialist traps and rather reification variables. When we have a situation which is fluid, when it's very complex, it's not difficult to pinpoint, we want to articulate it now in the language which seems like topical and hot and definitive, but then the result is quite the opposite. And there is a lot of reification, which is like we're trying to make we're trying to create notions of things which are by nature rather fluid, and we give them kind of essence, we give them a kind of personality, and they're not. So, but at the same time, I think it's important also to take a certain position and to derive rules for disengagement from this position, whatever it is. Could be nationalist, could be globalist, could be neoliberal, could be left-wing, whatever, but then there is so, I sense the lack of that definitive, well, a lack of identification with a certain intellectual position, and then the desire to use the rules of disengagement which are particular to this position. And we have a kind of very strange post-colonial, postmodern mix of actions and ideas, as I already gave in this example, when people talk about social constructivism and then jump over and to say, well, but the Kazakhs were the first. Also, and that is more often than not. And I think that we need to work with others more, and others with capital O as well, and start small. So that is something which doesn't sound very optimistic, but then probably that's what I want to end this conversation with. So
thank you so much, Alexey. Did a lot of very big questions and very little time. Yes, please.
Thank you, Alexey. You raised a lot of very important questions and topics, and I have a question. I think that when we speak about decolonization, we are also a bit trapped into repeating the Eurocentric view on the other, on us. I'm Central Asian as well, and whereas the true deconstruction of the colonial patterns probably would not be able or possible without the consideration of the diversity and national politics and ethnicity and so on, which is very difficult with the current censorship regarding this topic in our countries. So when you were talking about the arts, calling like a lot of art Uzbek, or if we do the same for Tajik or whatever, it's quite difficult to talk about decolonization without probably considering these identities, and especially it applies to art, because then it detaches a lot of legacy of other nations and ethnicities or peoples, to the represented art. So I wonder what's your opinion on how it would be possible? Maybe do you observe any possibilities how we can change that?
I agree in many ways. It's just that I think that to say that something is Eurocentric in our context, it often means to repeat the phrase which was developed in a different context. So you do remember the joke of the Soviet days when an American and a Russian are talking about freedoms, and an American says, I can go out in front of the White House and say, Reagan, go out, bastard. And the Russian says, well, I can do the same. I can go to the Red Square and also say, Reagan, go out, bastard. I think that very often our decolonial critique is replicating this thing. So we're sort of talking about the Eurocentric, and we're not, I mean, we are, I am, who? I don't know. We're not colonized by Europeans, like by the Brits and Americans. So in this case, the anger against them is a bit misplaced. But then again, for example, I consider myself now, I was kind of in the Soviet style, I would call myself half Russian, half Ukrainian, whatever it means, if it means anything at all. But then from Samarkand, and living in Samarkand for all my life, for several generations. So how do I have to think about myself? As decolonizer, the hybrid, and so I think that very often we want to find a definition which is simply not there. So I propose multiple definitions. The idea of we belong to multiple identities at the same time. And maybe being able to kind of differentiate between these things could help, at least on a notional level. It's very difficult, of course, to slice ourselves into different layers. But then you can probably think of different aspects of which you are part of this group, and here you are part of that group. And for example, when you say Uzbek, Tajik, and so on, whether we replicate the Soviet system, or do we go back to something which pre-existed, or, which is an interesting opportunity, which is not very often talked about, are we building something new? Which I find most interesting, actually. So I don't really want to rewriting history is, in the sense, reconsidering, redrafting it, yes, but, you know, again, fighting the wars of the past. I don't think that we can actually do that. So we'll probably have to think about decolonization as a process aimed for the future and towards something which is coming.
Thank you very much for this talk. I agree with a lot of the things you said. I do think, and I know for those who know me, I sound like a broken record when I say it, but like my main concern is that it's so just separated from class, this conversation of decolonization. And I believe, especially in Central Asia and in Uzbekistan, it occurs within a particular group of people who share a particular set of views and politics, and who are constructing the conversation in contradiction to the politics of Russia and in contradiction to the politics of their own country. So I think decolonial Uzbeks don't like Uzbekistan and they don't like Russia, and they want to construct a space for themselves, which they have the right to do, but their space lives in a bubble outside of what Uzbekistan actually is. And I believe that we cannot even actually generalize about decolonialism in Central Asia because we're actually ignoring the majority of the population. That's it. And I want to understand how you can actually fuse those two things, because in many ways they are contradicting to each other.
Absolutely. I entirely agree. And I think that I remember having a rather heated conversation with Kazakh friends who were all about victimization, and at a certain point I said, like, look, hang on. The fact that we are talking about this means we are in a privileged position. You and I, and we all do this. We sit in a kind of well-lit flat. We talk about Fanon. We talk about Chahan Valikhanov, or something which already is something which, I mean, but that's what you probably have to accept. So the thing which I cannot accept is pretending, or as we would call it, like believing your own lies. So it's okay to be mistaken. It's okay to generalize. It's okay to be wrong. And because you can't really be, you're not a god. But then what I think is, it would be, as you said absolutely correctly, I think that by this we're going to leave out the majority of the population. So people who live there without food, without water, without electricity, like 200 kilometers from Tashkent, they are not worried about Fanon, or whether it's a class thing, whether it's we should be left-wing rather than colonial, or whether it should be more like inclined towards colonial views of everything rather than Marxist. So all these debates are beyond them. But then it's a question of where you are, and you probably, I think that on a practical level, it would be important to understand where you are. So do not pretend that you are more than you are. And I can give you an example which I think kind of brought me in touch with this idea, is that when I started traveling, well, I traveled Tashkent, Samarkand very often. And I started taking pictures from the train. And somebody said, Alex, very good pictures, some interesting objects, but why don't you just go, travel there, and take pictures of those villages, of these people, of these things? And I said, yeah, good idea. Of course, the quality would be better. But then I realized, no, I am traveling by train. I'm crossing all this by train. I am in a train, I'm a passenger in a train. To pretend that I'm a kind of ethnographer who goes there and studies the life of the indigenous people, who does this, and then yeah. No, it's okay, but you have to. The only thing which I think is you have to understand what you're doing. It's not that it is bad. I mean, you could do that, but what we see very often when people sort of go on a holiday trip, but think that it's ethnographic research. No, it is not. Sorry, it is not. So. Yes.
Yeah, and it's not a question of ethnography or identity of the people. It's burning a question of resources.
Yes, I agree.
Thanks. I have kind of three questions that are related to each other, but before I have a very brief comment, to me the idea, I don't know, it's just, to me it was very interesting that you said that you're going to Baku to discuss, I don't know, decolonization and rethinking Russia centricity. That's like a really interesting place to be doing that, and probably not a place where you can actually do
Absolutely.
it due to government censorship, but anyway. So my first question is, in the first part of the talk you said that not all parts of Soviet ideology were colonial or were oppressive, so I just wanted to know what you meant by that. The second one is, why would we not say that Russians are European? And there are reasons why, I mean, Russians like to say that they're not European, right? But, for example, the way the border policy and the nation policy worked was basically the Soviets using Russian translations of French Enlightenment philosophy of the nation and imposing it on Central Asia, because obviously the nation is a concept and a model that is directly originating in Western Europe. And also, you know, Russian literature is part of the European literary canon in the way that, for example, Central Asian literature or Indian literature, which should be much better known in England, is not. And the second question is about language. I come from like an academic background in queer theory and also decolonial theory, and for me it's very interesting that when the war in Ukraine happened, everybody in sort of the Russian, Soviet, whatever space started using the word decolonial, not anti-colonial and not post-colonial. And that's very interesting for me because decolonial theory was a reaction against nationalist versions of anti-colonialism. It was a reaction that was done by women a lot of the time, not by straight women in South Asia and South America. And you know, it's a particular activist and epistemological strand that is anti-capitalist, that is anti-heteronormative, and that also anti-nation itself. And I just don't understand why in this space now this term is being used without any engagement with actual decolonial theory and activism. Yeah. And what's your, like, why did you use decolonial rather than anti-colonial?
Well, in fact, I think that the last thing is, to me, it's all more or less the same pattern, but pattern not cultural, but a more logical pattern. When something happens as a negation, it has got certain energy, and then it has got some kind of protest kind of content, and it's against something. But then gradually it becomes very close to something which it seeks to destroy. And it's not just about decolonial, post-colonial, it's not about Marxism and the Soviet system. It's about many things. Protestant religion as against the Catholic. So you've got this process which is, I think, is, I mean, Graham Harman, for example, talks about this. So, and I may choose to talk about this in terms of object-oriented ontology, for example. But somebody could say, like, any talk about OOO is like a neoliberal heresy. I mean, why are you pushing this format? Well, shall we talk about class theory, all right, or economics theory? So I think there are several different paradigms, and again, I find it difficult to kind of choose sides, in the sense that I see that still, you know, while we're articulating these things, we are on the same side of a privileged society. So, and whether it's queer theory, whether it's Marxist, whether it's anything which is articulated. We are privileged because we can work with articulated ideas and maybe reject them, accept them, modify them, or whatever. But that's already a privilege. So I think that it is a natural course of events. Otherwise, the situation would have been very different in the world. But then I do understand people who feel very strongly about, for example, well, okay, the beginning of the decolonial paradigm, right, was all about post-colonial theory, being academic, being white Anglo-Saxon, but what they turned into another rather kind of mainstream theory, which is, at the moment is, I mean, only a lazy one is not talking about it. Right, so it's this reductionism is there, but we maybe want to kind of try to resist that. And going back to your first question, when you say like the Soviet Union, Soviet ideology, you can have a reductionist viewpoint saying, well, Soviet ideology was just as good as fascist ideology. It's just killing people and destroying everything and oppressing everybody, which is there, but it would be a reductionist approach to say that that was the only thing. Or you could have a different viewpoint that was all utopian. It was all about freedom, about equality. It would be also a reductionist approach. So what I'm saying here is that, again, it will be probably useful to see what elements of what contained what kind of content. Yeah, so.
Thank you. This is all sorts of things going on, of course.
Yeah.
But in terms of what you just said, what I'm finding slightly perplexing is that sometimes you're talking in the present tense about current debates and you're aiming for clarification for new platforms for the future, but your title was about writing a kind of decolonialized or whatever art history. I don't know beginning when or ending when. And what I find very difficult with one of my Russian students in particular is a refusal to look at material heritage. Now, of course, you've shown us both paintings and buildings, but if one looks just at these paintings, I don't know who did them or when, okay, obviously presumably generated in Uzbekistan, iconographically and in terms of their material, by definition, they have a long European tradition. By definition, Uzbekistan did not invent aeroplanes or skyscrapers, and neither did Russians. Therefore, there's been a progress of material inventions and desires, and also, as you were saying rightly, I mean, the fight for resources, and then, for example, the circulation of oil, which is the underpinning of a lot of this. It's not just that we're all intellectuals discussing terms. I mean, even the very idea of fanon in Uzbekistan might raise eyebrows or brain cells. Because of the specificity of his situation, I think I mean, you know, even in terms of the dates of publication of certain colonial theories, you have a dense historical accumulation of things. So, I mean, I'm really fascinated I'm very, very fascinated with the problems, and I just wanted to say one other thing to do with style. I think it's very interesting. In 1995, when I was around in London, most people weren't, I presume, it was the Festival of Africa, okay? And there was, and it was still the time when people called a lot of African art, I mean, you know, people like Brian Sewell, the very right-wing Evening Standard critic of the time, said it's all dreadfully second-rate compared with what was going on in London or Paris or New York or whatever. And we are all into deconstructing these canons, of course. But what was interesting was an exhibition at the Whitechapel called 7 Stories from Africa. And what was extraordinarily clear was the minute these contemporary artists stopped doing painting and started doing installation, that whole argument collapsed. And if we apply this argument, if we look at the incredible female video artists from Kazakhstan, I'm mentioning them because I know them very much better than Uzbekistan, you cannot immediately say that things are second-rate or secondary or even need some decolonial gaze to deconstruct them. They are part of a global discourse which is not using the same criteria anymore. Installation and video and so forth, not the film industry, you've shown some funny, have gone beyond that. So I'm finding that there are layers here. Even the question of language, I studied the Sovietization, the forced Sovietization of the forcing of the Russian language on millions of people. So I just think that the layers, the archaeological layers of what went on in the history of material culture is very important in terms of the tenses of our discussion and whether we're talking about the past or the present or the future. Sorry, that was a bit confused, but I hope you get what I mean.
Yeah, okay. So I actually, I come from Uzbekistan, but I'm doing my PhD at Nazarbayev University, so I've lived in between two countries. But I came to Cambridge to have a round table for the first time about decolonization in Central Asia. So we organized a round table by 5 Central Asian scholars. And for the first time, we had a very long discussion by so what does decolonization mean for us? So there were very famous scholars, and there were contradicting ideas even between us. So each country depicted, because the 4 of us have been living in the UK and Europe for the last 15, 20 years. And their understanding of decolonization and mine, who is coming from other background, were really different. So decolonization is not about de-Russification, and it's not about nationalism. That was our kind of discussion, because there was Korean descendant who said that for her, for example, the Sovietization is quite difficult, and she feels some kind of challenges of being from a minor ethnic minority from Kazakhstan. So we started doing the things not about decolonization of only literature or desovietization, but from how to do it from Western distorted narrative, and the way of doing and the way of methodology. So we published a Zine book, each scholar contributing in a different way. I think you've been mentioning the works of Saulia Suleymanova, Saudat Ismailova. We had different artists. So decolonization, right? So it's not only about what we think art, but the way of doing and how to decolonize the mind. So so I came with few questions, but I'm leaving again with dozens or hundreds of questions, because there is no end. We cannot reach the final. So it should be start from the way of doing and how to deconstruct the European distorted narrative of methodologies. So that's it.
Alexey, some reaction as the last point.
I think there has been so much said, but my reaction would be that I'm very happy that this conversation is taking place. It would have not been possible 10 years ago. It would have not been possible, this conversation, and it's not just because people didn't read enough at that time, it's just the conversation would have not been possible. It would have not been happening. And I think that it's still, it doesn't really, I don't want to sound sort of hopeless relativist, saying that we don't know all the truth, everybody is right to a certain extent, everybody is wrong, but then I find it extremely difficult to do this analytical work. And when I hear certain things and I react to them on an intellectual level, I think there's something fishy about this, and I'm not happy with that. It's not very easy to think through that in a prudent manner so that to understand why you're not happy. So what makes you unhappy? Because I did dislike certain classifications, but I find it difficult to say why I dislike them. And it takes a lot of effort, at least for me, to kind of apply some kind of analytical rigor to this process and say, well, here we have a kind of a situation which is blurred, and we take it as two separate things, and that is an error in my view. Here there are two different things which we take as one. There's another error. So, and I'm saying that it is difficult. All I'm saying, it is difficult. I'm not happy with the way I can formulate that at the moment, but that's the only way to go, and to refine those arguments.
The box is opened. But again, thank you so much, Alexey, for this very much mind-boggling questions. And now you are all invited to continue this conversation informally over the drinks in the bar, because outside there is some sort of an apocalypse happening right now. So I would, for those of you who don't have umbrellas, also you could just sort of stay in and wait until that will be over.
But we've got something on that place.
The reservation is done. But for whoever is not going, and also So, thank you so much, Alexey.
That's okay. Yeah. I just wanted to say that we have a table booked for us at a place called Ciao Bella. Yes, there's a table, I think, for 12 people. I don't know how we're going to differentiate between ourselves, who wants us to join, who doesn't want to join, but that's what I'm saying to you. Something goes on. Something is going on, really. So I'm determined to go there and to talk to the people who I haven't seen for ages. So let's just see how it goes. Oh, thank you very much. But somebody has to lead the way. Nathan, can you kind of be there? Oh, you're going home. You are... No apologies. Oh, somebody has to actually do that.